Hello and welcome. My name is Leslie Crook, and I work as the manager of food entrepreneurship on the food team for Local First Arizona. I have an extensive background in the food industry. I've worked every job in kitchens, and I primarily focused on baking and pastry in my later career. And now I get to work with business owners throughout the state of Arizona to help them through any issues they might be having with their business or how I can support them to expand and scale. One of the topics I talk about often is about food costs, how to make those calculations, and how to price your items, whether it's going retail on your menu or if you're going to sell through a wholesale distributor. So let me bring up this presentation and we can get right to it. The food cost and product pricing is the name of the conversation today. Some of the things we're going to talk about standardized recipes and why utilizing a standardized recipe in your operation is very important. We'll talk about scaling recipes. It's not just a matter of multiplying a recipe by 2 or 4 to make a bigger batch. We'll talk about the proper way to do that. I'm going to talk to you about the difference between volume and weight when you are measuring out recipes. Also touch on the use of imperial versus metric system when you are measuring. And then finally, into the product pricing piece, we're going to talk about how to make appropriate food cost calculations. I'll cover the ideal percentage breakdown in your operation. And then I'm going to show you how to calculate wholesale prices and retail pricing. So first off, let's touch on standardized recipes. Here's an example of what a standardized recipe might look like. And you can make this in any format that works for your operation, whether you want to do this in a document or a spreadsheet, whatever you choose as your method, just make it standard across the board so that all of your recipes look similar. And you want to get into this recipe as much information as possible. So obviously the name of the dish, how much that recipe makes, and then how much is per portion. I like to include any plating. That's why there's a great picture in here, but you could actually change this picture out to what it should look like when you plate it or make it for the individual customer. Of course, you'll see the list of ingredients and the amounts of the ingredients needed to prepare this recipe. Then there are instructions, detailed instructions step by step. On the top right, you'll actually see the equipment and utensils that are needed to make this recipe, which helps to save some time when somebody is going to make this. They know what to grab when they go to their station to start preparing it. And then, of course, any information on here about holding or reheating, and again, how you would serve it, really helpful information to have on here. And I suggest doing this across the board for your recipes and actually making a binder of these so it's easy to reference when needed. So some of the benefits of formatting your recipes all the same like this, it makes it easier to find. As I mentioned, utilizing a binder where you could find all these things, you could have the recipes sorted by category. So if you make different breads, you can go through that section and find the recipe you're looking for, different meat production, sides, whatever that is. You can put them in the categories in that binder and you can flip to them and access the recipe you need very quickly. These recipes formatted in this way also help to make sure that all the ingredients are measured accurately. Especially as I mentioned before about scaling your recipes, sometimes it's nice to have standardized recipes in a few forms depending on the size batch you want to make. This way, nobody has to stop what they're doing, make the calculations, and then proceed with making the recipe. They just have it at the ready. Also, it's a good opportunity to make sure that everything is in the right unit of measure. I put some examples, each, bunch, dozen. Consider that when you're writing your recipe and figure out ways that you can actually make some shortcuts. For instance, if you have a recipe where you need 2 cups of cilantro chopped and put into this recipe, rather than taking the time to measure out 2 cups of chopped cilantro, perhaps write the recipe to just include 3 bunches of cilantro chopped. It'll decrease the time in measuring and then make sure that things are accurate across the board. Again, I mentioned creating the binder with this information. This will increase your efficiency, make sure that everything's coming out consistent, and it eases the burden of training new employees. They can grab the binder, find all the step-by-step instructions, they see how it should look at the finished end, and that way they can move on to the next task while you are focusing on something different instead of training them. So this is how to scale a recipe properly. And I know a lot of you, you're thinking just double it or quadruple it. And that's great for a lot of recipes. But as I mentioned, I spent a lot of my career in baking and pastry. With baking, there are actually things called baker's ratios. And it includes like the flour content, the water content, the fat, leavening agents, things like that. And that ratio needs to be the same each time you make the batch, regardless of the size batch you're making, so that the end product is the quality and the result that you are looking for. And using this recipe conversion to scale your recipes is more accurate. And I'll explain as we go through. So step one, you're going to take your recipe, the original recipe that you make, and you need to calculate the yield. In this circumstance, I have it 5 pounds was the total yield of the recipe. And I converted that to ounces for ease of comparison. So I took 5 pounds times 16 ounces. There's 16 ounces in a pound. And that gave me the 80 total ounces that came out of that recipe. And of those 80 ounces, I can make 20 each, or 20 units of whatever the product is that I'm creating. Step two is you're going to identify the desired weight or the yield that you want to come out of that recipe. For instance, in this circumstance, I have an order where I actually need 35 each out of the yield and not just 20. And rather than doubling it and supposedly getting 40, we can actually make this more precise and make the recipe to fulfill that order, which is way more efficient. So my desired yield for 35 each, I'm going to take the similar calculations as what it was per piece from the standard recipe. And now I can calculate that I need 8.75 or 140 ounces of a finished yield to give me that 35 each. So here's how you calculate the conversion factor. You're going to take the desired yield, the 140 ounces, and you're going to divide it by the original yield, the 80 ounces. And I get this number 1.75. That 1.75 is the conversion factor you're going to use to scale the rest of the ingredients in the recipe. So you just multiply each one. You multiply the flour by 1.75, the butter, the leavening, the salt, any other ingredients in the recipe. You're going to use that 1.75 to create the scaled recipe. This is really important when you're talking about things that are used in smaller portions in recipes. Think of salt or leavening agents. This ensures that you're not putting too much in, because the difference between 1 teaspoon and if you double the recipe to 2 teaspoons of that leavener, it's going to change the result of the end product by a lot. So here's my pop quiz. What weighs more, a pound of feathers or a pound of lead? It's a trick question. They both weigh a pound. However, a pound of feathers, or rather a cup full of feathers and a cup full of lead, will weigh 2 very different things because we're talking about volume in these instances and not weight. A lot of our recipes in the US are built utilizing volume. Volume recipes, 1 cup, half cup, quarter cup, those kind of measurements, those measure space taken up by something. Whereas weight is how heavy the mass is. So this can drastically alter your recipes if you're not considering the difference in weight and you're just using volume measure. When you start making changes to recipes, for instance, the cup of flour is not going to weigh the same as a cup of sugar, or a cup of honey is not going to weigh the same as a cup of salt. They each have their own weight. One way to calculate these weight, rather than actually taking time out of your day to measure things in these different cup sizes and figuring out what that weight is, there are a lot of conversion weight factors available online. One of them that I like to use is King Arthur Baking. So www.kingarthurbaking.com, and you can search for an ingredient weight chart on their website. Then you can put in whatever the ingredient is, flour, salt, sesame seeds, whatever it might be, and it's going to give you that weight per cup. So now this will allow you to convert those recipes that are measured in volume and convert those to accurate weights. I mentioned this before, but 1 cup water versus 1 cup flour, 1 cup of water is always going to weigh 8 ounces because they're measured based on fluid ounces, where that 1 cup of flour is less than 8 ounces. So this is why the difference between weight and volume is so important. And again, when it comes to measuring recipes, weight is always going to be the most accurate. Now, let's chat really quickly about the difference between imperial or metric measurements. And we utilize a lot of times, we interchange both. We primarily use the imperial metric or the imperial system, which is ounces, pounds, quarts, gallons, and not so much on the metric side because it's milligrams, kilograms, liters, milliliters, grams. In baking, I personally use grams for weight because I find it to be more accurate than measuring by portions of an ounce. A lot of times things need to be 1/4 of an ounce or an 1/8 of an ounce. And sometimes digital scales are more accurate when you're measuring something in grams instead, because it won't necessarily differentiate between an 1/8 of an ounce and a 1/4 of an ounce, but it will definitely change based on the difference between individual grams. So utilizing a combination of those measuring systems is very common. Investing in a digital scale is a great way to make sure that all of your recipes are scaled accurately. They don't have to cost that much. A lot of them are $20 or less, and they run on batteries. So the most you're going to replace are batteries from time to time to make sure those measurements are accurate. So here's to give you a visual guide. A lot of us are very familiar with these kinds of measurements, these volume measurements. And here's just a quick reference so you can see what that is. So like the 1 cup on the right-hand side, you're going to see that that's 8 ounces. When it says 8 ounces or in the 240 milliliters, those are fluid ounces and those are fluid measurements. Because again, 1 cup of just any ingredient is not necessarily going to weigh only 8 ounces. These are good to have as pictures that you have in your production space. So whether you need a quick reference or an employee, have these available so that they don't have to work too hard to figure out what the conversion is. Now let's jump into the product pricing part of this presentation, and we're going to talk about food costs. Food cost is literally the amount spent on ingredients used to produce your saleable items. And I'm going to get into more detail on what those ingredients actually are, because we want to think holistically about the cost of making a saleable item in its entirety. So it's not just the raw ingredients, but it's your packaging, it's the labels that you've put on the finished product, it's the labor, maybe your overhead, maybe you're renting a kitchen or utilizing a space that you have to pay utilities on, or even transportation if you're doing delivery, things like that. All of these pieces need to be calculated as part of the food costs to give you an accurate view of what it legitimately costs. what it takes for you to produce these items. So here's a typical operation breakdown. We don't want to spend any more than 30% on our food cost, 30% on labor, 30% on overhead, which only leaves 10% for profit. So it's really important to make sure you have a good grasp on these percentages within your operation to make sure that you are maximizing your profits and finding areas where you can reduce those costs. So what if your operation isn't typical? Maybe you have a cold brew coffee cart and not a food trailer or a food pop-up business. Your food costs may be lower. So in the cold brew coffee cart, your food costs might be lower. The cost of your ingredients may be less, and not as long of a list as what somebody might have in their pop-up food business. Your labor might also be less expensive. Where a pop-up food operation, you might be spending a lot more in labor because you have to have multiple people. And sometimes your ingredients are just a premium. We like to support businesses that utilize local ingredients as much as possible, but sometimes you're going to spend a little bit more on those local ingredients as the ones that you can buy in bulk. But all of that is important to configure into these percentage breakdowns for your operation to make sure you're not spending too much in one category while you're neglecting another. Let's chat about sourcing, because this is one of the areas where you can affect the price of your ingredients directly from the provider or the vendor. So here's a list of some local vendors that I highly recommend utilizing or looking into to see what their prices are. One idea to help make this a little bit easier for you to work with is contacting these wholesale providers ahead of time. Reach out to wholesale distributors and ask them for their price list. Then you can also create a list of items or ingredients that you would utilize more often than others, and then can actually make you your own kind of custom menu for ordering. And depending on the ingredients that are utilized, maybe you'll find substitutions of different ingredients that are not as expensive, lowering the overall food cost. And then sometimes we do want to pay a little bit more because it is about the premium ingredients. And we want to make that call out on our menu so people understand where this higher price point might be coming from. Also, looking at these wholesale distributor portfolios and their price lists, over time, some of these prices are going to change. Things fluctuate. There have been increased prices on flour, on butter, eggs, all sorts of things based on whether these products are readily available in the market. And other things definitely affect the prices too, like gas prices and delivery costs might go up. Otherwise, they may just pad these prices into the cost of the ingredient. But it's important to look at these lists from time to time, maybe on a quarterly or a semi-annual basis, to make sure that you're adjusting your prices as needed on your end also. Another thing that I highly suggest when sourcing your ingredients is going back to thinking about your standardized recipes and measuring them correctly. Go ahead and make yourself a comprehensive inventory of all the ingredients you use to produce the items on your menu. You'll find out some things that are going to stand out. There will be things that are more expensive than other ingredients. You might also realize that you have more expensive ingredients on something that you make very seldomly, or you have ingredients that you literally only use for one dish. These are things that you might want to consider removing from the menu or finding an ingredient substitute that costs you less money. Because again, your inventory is money on your shelves. You don't make money on it until you turn that into products that you can sell. So let's talk about the cost of goods sold. And I'm going to share a calculation for you in just a moment that's going to break this down in a way that you can see what your inventory cost is, the cost of goods that you sold, and what food cost percentage you sold everything at, how that averages out. So you're going to need some things in hand to do this. You're going to want to know what your inventory costs are, your initial inventory, to any additional purchases that add to that inventory, and then the total you sold in food sales. Now, to create your inventory, this is a physical thing that needs to exist in your operation. This is going to require you, the business owner, or a manager that you trust, physically sitting down and looking at the inventory costs, making a list of everything that's on the shelf, assigning a dollar amount to them, and even quantity available. Because on that inventory list, you can also set PARs, which means the minimum amount that you need to keep on the shelves at all times. So it makes it easier for ordering purposes, and in this circumstance, easier to look at all the costs involved to make your products. So here's where we can look closer at how to plug in the food cost formula to see what your percentage is. So again, you're going to start with that beginning inventory. This is what the manager or you, the business owner, has calculated as far as what that total beginning inventory cost is. In this circumstance, we're using $10,000. $10,000 is our beginning of the week inventory costs. Then throughout the week, you had to purchase $4,000 worth of additional items. These $4,000 are added to that initial inventory cost. And then the end of the week costs are then subtracted from that total. And in this scenario, 11,000 was left at the end of the week. So you do the calculations, the 10,000 is the starting inventory, plus 4,000 of additional ingredients, and then subtract the 11,000 that was left at the end of the week, which equals $3,000. So $3,000 worth of inventory was utilized that resulted in $9,000 worth of food sales at the end of the week. So take the food cost, the $3,000 of inventory goods, divided by the sales, or the $9,000 in food sales that week, and that's going to equal our food cost percentage. So 3,000 divided by 9,000 equals 0.33, or 33.3%, which is really similar to being in line to our breakdown of that 30%. So food costs can also interchangeably be used for cost of foods sold. Sometimes we talk about both those terms. They mean essentially the same thing. Also in this formula, I'm utilizing the word sales. Sales can also be stand in for the word revenue. To accurately calculate these costs of food, again, you have to have this physical inventory and actual inventory on hand. You can make estimations, but then you're not going to have an idea of what your actual true dollar amount was. Also, when you have a dollar amount that is attached to your inventory that is accurate based on the physical items on your shelves, you can identify other things that are going to affect that inventory by the end of the week. Ingredients that might spoil, or maybe a package of something was damaged while it was sitting in storage, or it got torn open, something spilled on it, you had to throw it out. You can also check your storage areas to make sure that the temperature is correct for how you are holding and storing those items. This is a good opportunity on a weekly basis to check this stuff out, because sometimes we have unwelcome guests like pests, or somebody may have taken it upon themselves to remove something from your inventory to utilize for themselves. Theft. And this is a way, if you have an idea of what your physical inventory is on a weekly basis, you can identify these issues and you can remedy those quickly. Again, your inventory is the dollar value of the food product that's in your storage. This is money that you have yet to make. This is money you spent until you turn it into the products that you're going to sell. I always like to make sure that you understand that monetary value of your inventory. Think about things in your own house where you might have had equipment that doesn't work very well. A lot of us in the middle of summer, sometimes our air conditionings don't work. Sometimes our refrigerators don't work, and these go down. Inventory, rather, that is in there, or that money that is in there, can definitely be subject to spoilage or having to waste it to throw it out in case something like that happens. So to have a good idea of what your dollar value is in storage can help you protect that bottom line a little bit better. Maybe you don't need to have that much inventory on your shelves at a time. So are some other food costing calculations that you can make. The first one is to calculate total cost of amount purchased. So you'll take the price per pound and you'll multiply by the amount purchased to get the total cost. Amount purchased into ounces. So you take the amount purchased in pounds and you multiply that by 16. There are 16 ounces per pound, and that'll give you the total ounces. Now you can take that total cost of that amount purchased in step one and divide that by the amount in ounces. And this will give you the amount purchased cost per ounce. Now you can take that amount purchased cost per ounce and multiply that by your serving size of your recipe, and that will break down to the cost of one portion. Here's another visual to kind of bring this calculation home. So on the left-hand side, you'll see a quick recipe that I put together. This is not a legitimate recipe. This is just one to utilize as an example. You'll see all the ingredients on the left-hand side, the quantity per recipe in the middle, and you'll notice all the units are the same. Because for each of these, I wanted to know what the cost was per ounce so that I can figure out what it is per portion. So I probably didn't buy the flour in all ounces. So utilizing that calculation where you can get the total amount purchased and divide it by the number of ounces in the total in the product, that'll give you the price per ounce. So you'll see all-purpose flour, I want 20 ounces in this recipe. And I will have already calculated the cost per ounce is 0.07 or 7 cents per ounce. And then you can put in a little formula in this final column in the total. That's going to take the quantity in this column B and multiply it by D, the cost per ounce, to get us the total in E, $1.40. You keep going with those calculations to get the full recipe amount of the $4.44 at the bottom. That's what it cost me to make this entire recipe with all the ingredients. And you'll see my yield is 20 each units, or 20 each. And now I can take the total recipe cost, $4.44, and divide that by 20, giving me a cost per portion of 22 cents. But like I said, if you are not periodically looking at the costs of your ingredients over time, you don't know if you should be raising these prices or not. So again, semi-annually or annually, look at those prices where you are getting those products from and figure out, has the price changed over time, or maybe it's fluctuated in a way where it's gone up and then it's also come back down and you don't need to do anything about those prices. But like I said, I want you to calculate a holistic view of what this actually costs to create. So in this example, I only have the ingredients to make these dinner rolls. But if perhaps I'm selling this whole recipe and I'm going to sell these 20 each dinner rolls in this recipe, consider how you're going to package them for the customer. Are they going in a same box? Are they individually wrapped? If they're individually wrapped, do they have individual labels on them? Or is it one label on a larger box? You can build this in to the recipe exactly that way. So you could add 20 bags, 20 stickers, whatever that might be, and add that to the total cost of producing this recipe to figure out that price that is going to be more accurate and including all those other expenses that you have in your operation. So here's another way to present pricing or food costing based on a percentage pricing method. So I mentioned in the ideal breakdown, 30% is kind of where we're sitting with food costs. We don't like it to go much over that. But again, sometimes this happens. If we have premium ingredients or if something is labor intensive that's going to take more blood, sweat, and tears on your part, it's going to cost more. But alternatively, you might very well have other things on your menu that are lower, that are much lower than 30% food costs. So it kind of evens out. So having an idea or having a list of where those food cost percentages are, you can figure out if you're staying in that average. For this circumstance, we're talking about a product that was $4 to produce, $4 in raw food costs, meaning all the ingredients to make it. And our ideal percentage in this scenario, we want to be no more than 28%. So if that's the case, I can actually calculate the price of this item based on that food cost percent. So the equation, $4, your raw food cost, divided by your ideal food cost percentage, and that equals $14.29. So this $14.29 would be a great price for your menu. $14.29 is kind of a weird price to have on your menu in the first place. So I highly suggest rounding it up or even rounding it down. You could go to $14.25 or up to $14.50. There are other considerations to take into account when you're pricing these things on your menu and pricing in general. Think about what the market will bear. Is it reasonable to, in this circumstance, to charge $14.50 for this menu item? Are others charging something similar? And then figure out what differentiates your product from others in the market. If yours is more expensive because of premium ingredients, make sure that's listed on the menu so people understand what they're paying more money for. And again, what is your brand story? Maybe you highly prioritize heritage foods or native ingredients, and that's a big part of your brand. It might be those ingredients might come at a premium and it costs you more to get them, and overall it increases your menu price because of that. But tell that story. People want to understand why they're paying more. All of these questions can be applied to figure out what your best pricing model is going to be for your items. And it can be different, like your food cost percent is obviously going to be different depending on what product you're creating. So knowing your true costs, I've alluded to this before, but this will give you a breakdown of what your true costs are for your recipes or for your finished products. So things to keep in mind, of course, the raw materials utilized to make the product, the packaging. Are you using a bag? Are you using boxes? How are you labeling these things? Your production time. Is it just you? Is it multiple employees? You can actually figure out for a batch of something, you can keep track of how long it takes you to make that recipe. And you can add that in as your labor time. Again, any overhead, if you're paying kitchen rent or utilities, things like that, even insurance, your licenses, your permit fees, you can put this all into food costing so that you know the whole cost of what it is to produce this. And again, do you charge delivery fees or maybe storage fees? Delivery fees meaning like a vendor that's providing you with ingredients to make your items, are they charging you a delivery fee? Meaning the cost of those ingredients are slightly inflated because of that added expense. So you can add all these items up, and there are a couple ways you can do this. I mentioned the recipe previously, where you could actually figure out what it's going to cost for that recipe with 20 bags or one box to put all of the items in at the end. You can also calculate this by cost of goods sold, or COGS. So you can add these items up, all of these things, ingredients, packaging, labor, overhead, compliance, and logistics, add that to the cost of creating the recipe, and then divide that by the number of units made. So maybe it takes you $1,000 to make one large recipe, but at the end of it, I make 500 units. So this means $1,000 divided by 500 units, it's $2 per unit in addition. So $2 is your COGS to make these recipes, which you can then take to figure out wholesale pricing and retail pricing. So your wholesale margin is typically going to be 30 to 50% for the producer. You are the producer. Wholesale pricing and utilizing these percentages is the money that you are going to retain for this product. And of course, you're going to use like a lower margin for something that you would make in high volume. Maybe you make cookies and you bust out a lot of cookies, and each recipe of cookies makes a lot. So it might be a lower wholesale margin for those, closer to the 30%. But then maybe you also have something on your menu that is a specialty product. It utilizes special ingredients or takes a lot of labor, has multiple steps. You would go higher on that wholesale margin to protect yourself, to pad that in. So again, if you know your COGS for that recipe, so that is what it takes to produce that entire recipe, then you're going to divide that out. And in this circumstance, the equation has 1 minus your target margin in there. So you're going to take the $2, divide it by 1 minus 0.4, or 0.6 is the total. So $2 divided by 0.6 will give you $3.33. Again, round up for clarity to make it easier to understand. So instead of just making $3.33 the wholesale price, you could round up to $3.35 or $3.50. This wholesale price is the absolute bare minimum that you would ever sell this product for. You're not going to sell this to consumers at this low price because you don't make a lot of money on this. Your profit margins are very small. But this allows for you to participate in a wholesale market where you're providing in bulk to another retailer that's going to sell on your behalf. So with wholesale pricing, rather than pricing these per unit of food product that's made, figure out what that cost is going to be by the case, because retailers are more likely going to buy in bulk by the case versus individual units. You can do a similar calculation to figure out retail pricing. In this circumstance, retailers are the ones that want to make about a 50% profit. So if you already are starting with your wholesale price, you know that 30 to 50% margin was padded in for your benefit. That's what you make off of selling at wholesale. But now to sell at retail, we want that retailer to make money and make it an incentive for them to sell your products on your behalf. So utilizing the $3.35 to $3.50 per unit with a 50% profit, we're just going to multiply that by 2. So now the retail price of that item could be sold at $6.75 to $7. Thinking about these pricing schemes ahead of time, you want to be able to look at these questions like, is this price reasonable? What are other items that are in a similar category priced at? Is it in line with competitor products? Because again, if you are pricing your stuff and it's much higher than other products in a similar category, it may be sitting on the shelf longer than you want. So looking at all these things, doing these calculations ahead of time and figuring out where you really want these items priced. And in this circumstance for wholesale, you can also include this retail pricing to let that wholesaler know, I want you to sell this to the public at least at these prices. So this kind of support and technical assistance and more is available through our Local First Arizona Business Coalition and business support services. We see that there's power in numbers, and we are the largest small business coalition in the country. That means we have the most small businesses in this network that we can work with all throughout the state. We believe that this is building a competitive advantage by creating this collective power for Arizona business owners. We also think that supporting local businesses creates local jobs and it increases local prosperity. It keeps the jobs right in those communities. It keeps the money right in those communities so that we can ensure a lasting, strong economy as we move forward. If you're interested in learning how you can join Local First, we do have a different scheme for membership prices, starting at $99 for a year up to $499, depending on the number of employees you have. There are lots of business connections to be made. We host monthly mixers and other events where we invite all of our Arizona-based business owners to join us. They're usually free events. They have some kind of food and refreshment, and it's a great opportunity to network with other like-minded Arizona-based business owners. There are also opportunities for more media exposure and perks with some of our special events. Being a member of our business coalition means that you have the opportunity to join us in our large signature events like Fall Fest that we host every November at the Margaret T. Hance Park. You also have power in advocacy and policy. All these policies that affect our local businesses, we're very aware of. So having this kind of large business coalition backing gives us more agency and gives us more power. So people are listening to what we're saying, and we are promoting a better, more vibrant, all-inclusive Arizona economy. If you'd like to know more about some of the topics that I discussed in this presentation, please check out our website at www.devourgoodfood.com or email the team, the food team, over at communitykitchens@localfirstaz.com. And if you have questions about membership, we're happy to answer those questions for you, or you can send them an email, membership@localfirstaz.com.